Julian Cross stood at the center of the grand ballroom of the St. Clair Hotel, the air buzzing with conversation and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. The evening's charity gala was in full swing, a spectacle of glittering lights and elegant attendees. This was New Orleans at its finest, where the city's elite gathered to display their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. Julian adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, his practiced smile firmly in place as he nodded to a passing guest. Despite the lively atmosphere, his mind was elsewhere, distracted by the relentless churn of his company's operations. Crosstech, his tech empire, had weathered storms of controversy in the past year, and this gala was as much about salvaging his company's image as it was about raising money for local charities. "Julian," came the voice of Megan, his trusted assistant, as she approached with a clipboard in hand. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd before landing on him. "The mayor wants a photo with you near the stage, and after that, you're scheduled for a quick word with the press." "Of course," Julian replied smoothly, his smile unwavering. "Let's make it quick." As they maneuvered through the room, Megan leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "By the way, I've reviewed the proposal for the St. Bernadette redevelopment project. It's controversial, to say the least. The shelter's community is already pushing back hard, and we've got whispers of protests." Julian frowned slightly but didn't break stride. "Is the board aware?" "They are," Megan said. "But Adrian Shaw is the one driving this. He's convinced it's a necessary step for our long-term growth." Julian's jaw tightened at the mention of Adrian. The man was a sharp negotiator, but had a reputation for prioritizing profits over principles, a trait that had caused tension in board meetings. "I'll look into it," he said curtly, "after tonight." As they reached the stage, Julian slipped effortlessly into his role, shaking hands with the mayor and posing for photos. The flash of cameras and the murmur of approval from the crowd were familiar to him, but they no longer brought the satisfaction they once did. There was an emptiness in these moments, a nagging sense that something vital was missing. Later, as the gala wound down, Julian found himself on the balcony, looking out over the city. The sprawling lights of New Orleans stretched out before him, a reminder of the complexity and beauty of the place he called home. Yet beneath the surface of this vibrant city lay stark inequalities, a reality he had learned to ignore in favor of corporate pursuits. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Megan. "Meeting at St. Bernadette's, scheduled for tomorrow at noon. Board expects your input." Julian exhaled deeply, pocketing the phone. He had no intention of letting the project spiral out of control, but he also knew that balancing the expectations of his board and the needs of the community was a task fraught with challenges. The next morning, Julian's sleek black car pulled up in front of Crosstech's headquarters, a towering glass building that reflected the bustling streets of New Orleans. Inside, the hum of conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards greeted him as he strode through the lobby. His schedule was packed, but one item loomed larger than the rest, the meeting about the St. Bernadette project. In the boardroom, Adrian Shaw was already seated at the head of the table, a stack of neatly printed documents in front of him. He rose with a confident smile when Julian entered. "Julian," Adrian said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it. We've got big plans for the St. Bernadette site." Julian shook his hand, though the forced cordiality between them was palpable. "Adrian," he replied, "let's hear what you've got." Adrian launched into a polished presentation, complete with projected revenue figures, architectural renderings of luxury apartments, and a timeline designed to minimize delays. "This redevelopment is a game changer," he concluded, his enthusiasm palpable. "We're talking about transforming a dilapidated shelter into a high-end residential complex. It's a win-win." Julian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And the community that relies on St. Bernadette, what happens to them? Adrian's smile didn't falter, but there was a subtle shift in his tone. We're offering relocation assistance. It's all in the proposal. Besides, that shelter is a liability. It's outdated, underfunded, and frankly, an eyesore. This project will elevate the entire area. Julian's gaze swept the room, noting the expectant faces of the other board members. Some nodded in agreement with Adrian, while others avoided eye contact. Megan, seated near the end of the table, gave him a subtle, knowing look, one that said, "This isn't as simple as it seems." "I'll need to see the full breakdown," Julian said finally, "and I want to visit the site myself before making any decisions." Adrian's smile tightened. "Of course. I've arranged for a walkthrough tomorrow. You'll see firsthand why this project is the right move." The meeting adjourned, and as the board members filed out, Megan lingered behind. "You're not convinced," she said, more a statement than a question. "Not even close," Julian admitted, running a hand through his hair. "There's more to this than the numbers Adrian keeps throwing around." "You're right," Megan said. "The shelter's director, Sienna Brooks, has been very vocal about her opposition. If you're going to the site, you'll likely meet her." Julian froze at the name, his mind racing. Sienna. It had been a year since their last conversation, a conversation that had ended their marriage. The thought of seeing her again brought a wave of conflicting emotions, but he pushed them aside. "Fine," he said after a moment. "I'll handle it." Megan hesitated. "Julian, this might get personal." "It won't," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "It's business." As he left the boardroom, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that the meeting at St. Bernadette's would be about much more than a redevelopment project. Under the bright midday sun, Julian's car rolled to a stop in front of the St. Bernadette shelter. The building stood out starkly against the surrounding neighborhood, a modest, weathered structure that seemed to bear the weight of countless untold stories. The faded sign above the entrance hinted at better days, while the steady stream of people coming and going underscored its importance to the community. Julian stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket as he took in the scene. Children played in a small fenced area to the side, their laughter mingling with the faint hum of traffic. Volunteers moved with purpose, handing out supplies and organizing what appeared to be a donation drive. There was an undeniable energy here, a sense of resilience that Julian couldn't ignore. As he approached the entrance, a woman's voice called out sharply, "Excuse me, can I help you?" He turned to see a tall woman with dark, piercing eyes and an air of authority. She held a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other, clearly someone who knew how to keep things running smoothly. "I'm here to meet with the director," Julian said, offering a polite smile. "Julian Cross." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly at his name. "Of course you are," she said dryly, before gesturing toward the entrance. "Wait here. I'll let her know." Julian barely had time to process the curt response before she disappeared into the building. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling out of place amidst the bustling activity around him. Moments later, the door opened again, and there she was, Sienna. She stepped out with a deliberate calm, her expression unreadable. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, and her posture was as poised as he remembered, though there was a new weight in her eyes. In her arms, she carried a small baby wrapped in a light blue blanket. Julian's breath caught as his gaze shifted to the child. The baby's tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, clutching at the fabric with unconscious determination. "Sienna," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "Julian," she replied, her tone steady but cool. "I didn't think you'd actually show up." "I wanted to see the place for myself," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the shelter. "It seems Important. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It is, but I doubt that's why you're here. Before he could respond, the baby stirred in her arms, letting out a small whimper. Sienna adjusted the blanket, her movements instinctive and gentle. Julian's curiosity deepened as questions swirled in his mind, but he forced himself to focus. "Can we talk?" Sienna hesitated, then nodded toward a bench near the building. 5 minutes, she said, already walking ahead. Julian followed, unsure of what to expect, but determined to make sense of the unexpected encounter. Julian sat down on the bench next to Sienna, his gaze flicking between her and the baby in her arms. Up close, the child's features were more distinct. A small, delicate face framed by tufts of soft brown hair. Something about him stirred an unnameable feeling in Julian, a mix of wonder and unease. Sienna didn't look at him as she adjusted the baby's blanket again, her movements purposeful. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked, her tone sharp but measured. "If you're here to make some kind of PR gesture, save it. This shelter doesn't need another check from someone who doesn't care." Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not here for that," he said. "I wanted to see the shelter myself, understand what's at stake." She let out a dry laugh, finally meeting his eyes. "You don't need to understand what's at stake. The people who come here, families, veterans, kids, they've already lost everything. What they have left is this place. And now your company wants to take it from them." Julian opened his mouth to respond, but Sienna cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "You think a glossy high-rise is worth more than this. You think it's progress. I've seen what happens when places like this are torn down. Those people out there," she said, gesturing toward the shelter grounds, "don't just disappear when you push them out. They end up in worse places, if they survive at all." Her words hit harder than Julian expected, and for a moment he struggled to find a response. "Sienna, it's not that simple," he said finally. "The board. The board," she repeated bitterly. "Always the board. Do you ever make decisions for yourself, Julian? Or do you just hide behind other people's greed?" Julian flinched but held his ground. "You think I don't care, but I do. I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Sienna's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "Then prove it," she said quietly. "Because right now, you're just another suit to me. Another face telling me that people like us don't matter." Before Julian could respond, the baby let out a soft coo, breaking the tension. Sienna glanced down at him, her face softening in a way that Julian hadn't seen in years. The sight stirred something in him, and the question that had been simmering in his mind finally escaped. "Is he—" Julian hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he mine?" Sienna stiffened, her grip tightening on the baby. She stood abruptly, her posture defensive. "This isn't about Ariel," she said firmly. "This is about the shelter. If you really care, you'll fight for it. Otherwise, stay out of my way." She turned and walked back toward the building, leaving Julian alone on the bench. The weight of her words settled heavily on him, along with the unresolved question about Ariel. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Not with Sienna, and not with the shelter. As Julian stood and glanced toward the shelter one last time, he felt a strange sense of purpose begin to take shape. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or boardrooms. He was thinking about something, or someone, bigger than himself. Under the dim light of his office, Julian leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the folder Megan had placed on his desk earlier that evening. The label read, Saint, Bernadette Shelter, Community Overview, and it was filled with reports, statistics, and a list of names tied to the shelter. He'd requested it out of curiosity, but now he wasn't sure if he wanted to open it. His mind wandered back to his encounter with Sienna earlier in the day. Her words lingered in his thoughts, each one laced with an anger that wasn't just about the shelter. It was about him, his choices, and everything he had let slip away. And then there was Ariel. The baby's face was etched in his mind, and the unresolved question about his connection to the child gnawed at him. With a sigh, Julian reached for the folder and flipped it open. The first page was a summary of the shelter's history, detailing its founding as a sanctuary for displaced families after Hurricane Katrina. He skimmed through it until his eyes landed on a list of residents and their stories. Each name had a brief description of their circumstances. A veteran battling PTSD, a single mother fleeing domestic violence, a teenager cast out by her family for her sexuality. It was overwhelming, and Julian found himself wondering how Sienna had the strength to face these realities every day. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Megan entered without waiting for a reply, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Late night?" she asked, setting one down in front of him. "Something like that," Julian replied, closing the folder. He took a sip of the coffee, grateful for the distraction. Megan sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "You met with Sienna Brooks today?" Julian nodded. "I did." "And?" "And she's furious," he said with a faint, humorless laugh. "Not that I blame her." Megan raised an eyebrow. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "That's the question, isn't it? I don't know if I can fight the board on this. Adrian's practically running the show, and half the directors are in his pocket." "You're the CEO," Megan pointed out. "If anyone can challenge him, it's you." Julian shook his head. "It's not that simple. There's too much at stake." "More than what's at stake for the people at St. Bernadette," Megan interrupted, her tone sharper than usual. "Julian, I've worked for you long enough to know when you're making excuses. If you want to do the right thing, you're going to have to take risks." Her words struck a chord, and Julian couldn't find a reply. Megan stood, straightening her jacket. "Think about it," she said before leaving the room. Alone again, Julian stared at the closed folder on his desk. Megan was right. The time for excuses was over. Julian sat in silence for a few moments after Megan left, her words echoing in his mind. If he wanted to do the right thing, he had to take risks. But what risks? Standing up to Adrian and the board could mean jeopardizing his position, his reputation, and the company he had spent years building. The thought was daunting. But so was the memory of the people he had seen at St. Bernadette, their faces, their struggles, and the weight of Sienna's accusations. Determined to gain more clarity, Julian picked up his phone and dialed a number from the folder. After a few rings, a calm, steady voice answered. "This is Detective Cole." "Detective, this is Julian Cross," he said. "I believe we've met before at a gala a few years back. I need to ask you about St. Bernadette Shelter." There was a brief pause before Cole replied, "I'm listening." Julian explained his concerns about the redevelopment project and Adrian's involvement, carefully choosing his words to avoid revealing too much about his personal connection to the shelter. Cole listened patiently, his tone remaining neutral. "I've seen Adrian's name pop up in a few questionable deals," Cole admitted when Julian finished. "But nothing I could pin on him, at least not yet. If he's pushing to redevelop St. Bernadette, there's probably more to it than meets the eye." "That's what I'm worried about," Julian said. "If there's anything you can find, documents, transactions, anything, it could make a difference." Cole hesitated. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But you should know, St. Bernadette isn't just a shelter. For some of us, it's personal." "What do you mean?" Julian asked, intrigued. Cole sighed, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of emotion. "I grew up not far from there. After my dad passed, my mom and I ended up at St. Bernadette for a while. It's the kind of place that gives people hope when they've got nothing else." Julian absorbed this, his resolve hardening. "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate your help." After ending the call, Julian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Cole's story was a reminder of what was at stake. Not just a building, but the lives it touched. He couldn't let Adrian destroy that, not without a fight. The next morning, Julian arrived at the Crosstech office earlier than usual. He called an impromptu meeting with Megan and his legal team, laying out his plan to investigate Adrian's dealings. He knew the risks, but for the first time in years, Julian felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. As he left the meeting, Megan caught up with him in the hallway. "So, what's next?" she asked. Julian paused, his expression resolute. "I'm going back to St. Bernadette. If I'm going to fight for this place, I need to see more of what it stands for, and I need to talk to Sienna again." Megan smirked faintly. "Good luck with that." Julian chuckled, though the prospect of facing Sienna again filled him with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As he headed toward the elevator, he knew this wasn't just about saving the shelter. It was about finding a way to make things right, for Sienna, for Ariel, and maybe even for himself. Julian parked his car across the street from St. Bernadette Shelter, taking a moment to steady his thoughts before stepping out. The shelter looked much the same as it had on his first visit, but this time he noticed details he'd overlooked: the peeling paint on the shutters, the uneven pavement outside, and the handwritten signs taped to the windows advertising free meals and legal aid. It was a place that bore the wear and tear of countless struggles, but refused to let itself be defined by them. He crossed the street and entered the building. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of controlled chaos and quiet determination. Volunteers moved quickly between rooms, carrying crates of supplies and folding freshly laundered clothes. A group of children sat at a makeshift table in the corner, coloring with worn crayons, while an elderly man supervised them with a gentle smile. "Mr. Cross," came a voice from his left. He turned to see Grace, the woman who had greeted him so brusquely on his last visit. Today her expression was less guarded but still wary. "Back again?" "I need to speak with Sienna," Julian said simply. Grace nodded, her gaze appraising. "She's in the dining hall. Follow me." The dining hall was a large, multi-purpose room filled with long tables and folding chairs. On one side, a line of people waited patiently as volunteers served them hot meals from a counter. At the far end, Sienna stood, clipboard in hand, giving instructions to a group of new volunteers. She wore her usual air of quiet authority, her movements confident and purposeful. Grace motioned for Julian to wait while she approached Sienna, speaking quietly in her ear. Sienna's head turned sharply at the mention of his name, her expression shifting to one of mild exasperation. With a brief nod, she dismissed Grace and walked over to Julian. "You're persistent," she said as she approached, crossing her arms. Julian offered a faint smile. "I thought we could talk. Somewhere less hectic." Sienna hesitated, then gestured toward a side door. "Fine. Let's make this quick." They stepped into a small office filled with mismatched furniture and stacks of paperwork. Sienna shut the door behind them and leaned against the desk, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Julian? Because I'm pretty sure you didn't come here for a tour." "I came to understand," Julian said earnestly. "About the shelter, about you, about Ariel." At the mention of Ariel, Sienna's jaw tightened. "We're not doing this," she said, her voice clipped. "Ariel isn't part of this conversation." "He is to me," Julian countered. "But fine, let's focus on the shelter. I need to know why it means so much to you." Sienna regarded him for a long moment, before exhaling sharply. "Because this isn't just a building. It's a lifeline. People come here when they have nowhere else to go. And for some of them, it's the first place they've ever felt safe. Her words were heavy with conviction, and Julian felt the weight of them settle in his chest. "I want to help," he said finally, "but I need you to trust me." Sienna laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Trust you?" "Julian, trust isn't something you can just ask for. You have to earn it." Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and met Sienna's unwavering gaze. "Then tell me how," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me what I need to do." For a moment, Sienna said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she walked to the office window, pulling back the worn curtain and looking out at the bustling activity in the shelter courtyard. "You want to help?" she said finally, her tone laced with skepticism. "Start by understanding the people who rely on this place. They're not just numbers in a report or obstacles in a redevelopment plan. They're people with real stories, real lives." Julian followed her gaze, seeing the courtyard through her eyes. A mother guided her toddler toward a volunteer handing out clothing. A young man with a tattered backpack sat on a bench staring at the ground, his shoulders hunched. A pair of elderly women chatted quietly over cups of coffee, their hands trembling from age or hardship. "I'm not blind to what's happening here," Julian said quietly, "but I've spent my career making decisions based on facts and figures. If you want me to see what you see, then show me." Sienna turned to face him, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. "Fine," she said after a moment. "Come back tomorrow morning. Spend the day here. Talk to the residents, help the volunteers, and then tell me if you still think this place is just another piece of real estate." Julian nodded, sensing the challenge in her voice. "I will." Sienna crossed her arms again, but the hard edge in her demeanor softened slightly. "And one more thing," she added. "Leave your suit at home. You're not here to impress anyone." Julian allowed himself a small smile. "Noted." As he stood to leave, his eyes caught a framed photograph on the desk. It was a simple picture of Sienna surrounded by children, all of them smiling brightly. In her arms, a younger Ariel clutched a stuffed animal, his chubby face beaming with joy. The sight stirred something deep in Julian, and he looked back at Sienna. "You've done incredible work here," he said sincerely. Sienna's expression softened, but only for a moment. "This isn't about me, Julian. It's about them." He nodded, understanding her meaning, and left the office. As he walked back through the shelter, the weight of the stories and struggles he'd glimpsed began to sink in. This wasn't just about saving a building or proving a point to Sienna. This was about making a choice between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Julian got into his car. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe purpose, maybe hope. Whatever it was, he knew he wasn't done with St. Bernadette Shelter or with Sienna and Ariel. Tomorrow would be the start of something new. Julian arrived at the shelter early the next morning, dressed down in jeans and a simple button-up shirt. The suit and tie were gone, replaced by something far more practical and far less imposing. As he stepped through the shelter's doors, the atmosphere hit him immediately. The noise, the movement, the sheer number of people, all of it was a stark reminder of just how much this place was holding together. Grace was the first to spot him. She arched an eyebrow, her expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Well, look who decided to dress like a regular person," she said, crossing her arms. Julian smirked, taking the comment in stride. "I'm here to work, not to impress." "We'll see about that," Grace replied, handing him a clipboard. "Sienna told me to put you to use. Let's see if you can keep up." His first task was helping in the kitchen, a bustling hub of activity where volunteers moved with practiced efficiency to prepare breakfast. The shelter served hundreds of meals each day, and the sheer scale of the operation was eye-opening. Julian found himself chopping vegetables alongside a teenager named Marcus, who chatted animatedly about his plans to attend culinary school. "So, what brought you here?" Julian asked, genuinely curious. Marcus shrugged but smiled. "St. Bernadette did. I was on the streets for a while after I left foster care. This place gave me a roof, 3 meals, and a shot at figuring out my life. Now I help out when I can." Julian nodded, impressed by the young man's resilience. "Sounds like you've got a good head on your shoulders." "Better than some," Marcus replied with a laugh. "But hey, everyone here's just trying to make it. That's why this place matters." As the morning wore on, Julian rotated through various tasks, organizing supplies, cleaning tables, even unloading a delivery truck. Each job brought him face to face with the residents and their stories. He met Cecilia, a single mother who had fled an abusive relationship with her 2 young daughters, and Andre, a veteran struggling with PTSD who found solace in the community the shelter provided. By midday, Julian was wiping sweat from his brow, his shirt damp from the humidity in the dining hall. He was exhausted, but something about the work felt grounding. It was a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms and carefully curated events that had defined his life for so long. Sienna appeared during the lunch rush, her clipboard in hand and her steps brisk as she navigated the crowded room. She caught sight of Julian cleaning tables and stopped, her expression unreadable. "You look busy," she said, her tone neutral. "Just doing my part," Julian replied, straightening up. "How am I doing so far?" Sienna tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You haven't scared anyone off, so I'd say you're ahead of most." Julian chuckled, though he could tell she wasn't quite ready to lower her guard. Before he could say more, a commotion broke out near the serving line. A man had raised his voice, gesturing angrily at a volunteer. Sienna moved toward the disturbance immediately, her calm authority cutting through the noise. Julian followed instinctively, curious about how she handled such situations. As he approached, he could hear the man's frustration spilling over. "You don't know what it's like out there," the man shouted, his hands clenched into fists. "Don't tell me to calm down. I've lost everything." Sienna stepped in, her voice firm but compassionate. "We're here to help, but you need to take a breath and talk to us. What's going on?" The man hesitated, his anger softening under Sienna's steady gaze. "They said there's no space left. I've got nowhere else to go." Julian watched as Sienna guided the man away from the crowd, speaking with him in low tones until he nodded and seemed to relax. She then motioned to a volunteer who brought over a meal and a seat for him. The situation diffused. She returned to Julian's side. "You handle that often?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "More often than I'd like," she admitted. "But that's the job. People come here because they're desperate. Sometimes they just need to know someone's listening." Julian nodded, absorbing her words. He realized that what Sienna was doing went far beyond providing food and shelter. She was giving people dignity, a sense of worth in a world that had taken so much from them. As the lunch rush subsided, Julian found himself reflecting on the day so far. Each person he'd met, each story he'd heard, painted a clearer picture of why this shelter mattered and why it needed to survive. By the time the afternoon sun began to filter through the shelter's worn windows, Julian was seated in the courtyard, watching a group of children play with a battered soccer ball. Their laughter was infectious, and despite the weight of the morning's work, Julian felt an unexpected sense of lightness. These small moments of joy, he realized, were what gave St. Bernadette its strength. Sienna joined him a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of water. She handed one to Julian without a word and sat down beside him, her gaze following the children's movements. For a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet companionship speaking volumes. "You surprised me today," Sienna said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't think you'd actually show up, let alone stick it out." Julian took a sip of water, considering his response. "I needed to see it for myself," he said. "The people here, they're not just statistics. They're fighting battles I can't even imagine." Sienna nodded, her expression softening. "That's why this place matters. It's not just a shelter, it's hope. And once you take that away—" She trailed off, her voice tinged with sorrow. Julian turned to her, his tone earnest. "I don't want to take it away. I'm starting to understand why you fought so hard for this place. But I need your help if I'm going to stop Adrian and the board." Sienna's brow furrowed as she considered his words. "You're serious about this?" "I am," Julian said firmly, "but I can't do it alone. I need more than just numbers or stories. I need the full picture. I need to know what Adrian's really up to, and I need to build a case that the board can't ignore." Sienna leaned back, her arms crossed. "There's a lot of history here. Adrian's been pushing for this redevelopment for years. He sees the shelter as a liability, something that doesn't fit with his vision for the neighborhood." "Then we need to prove him wrong," Julian said. "Show the board and the city what this place really means." Sienna was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the children in the courtyard. Finally, she turned back to Julian, her expression resolute. "All right," she said. "If you're serious about this, I'll help. But you need to understand something, Julian. This isn't just about saving a building, it's about saving lives." "I understand," Julian replied. And for the first time, he truly believed it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Grace appeared, her face serious. "Sienna, we've got a problem," she said, glancing at Julian. "You're going to want to see this." Sienna stood immediately, motioning for Julian to follow. Grace led them inside to the main office, where a small crowd of volunteers had gathered around an old television. The local news was playing, and the headlines scrolling across the screen made Julian's stomach drop. "New push for St. Bernadette Shelter, redevelopment gains momentum." The accompanying footage showed Adrian Shaw at a press conference, standing in front of a glossy rendering of luxury apartments. "This project will revitalize the area," Adrian was saying, his tone polished and confident. "We're creating opportunities for growth, for progress. The shelter has served its purpose, but it's time to move forward." The room buzzed with frustration and disbelief as the volunteers exchanged worried glances. Sienna's jaw tightened, and Julian could see the fire in her eyes. "He's not wasting any time," she said, her voice low but steely. Julian felt a surge of anger and determination. Adrian's calculated maneuver was a clear attempt to undercut the shelter's efforts before they even had a chance to rally support. But if Adrian thought he had the upper hand, Julian was determined to prove him wrong. "What's the plan?" Julian asked, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. Sienna looked at him, her expression hard but focused. "We fight," she said simply. "We fight with everything we've got." Julian nodded, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was in this fight now, and he wouldn't back down. Julian sat at the head of the table in a small, dimly lit conference room at Crosstech's headquarters. The room wasn't designed for high-stakes strategy meetings, but today it served as the nerve center for his plan to counter Adrian Shaw's aggressive push for the redevelopment project. Around the table sat Megan, Grace, and Detective Cole, who had agreed to meet after uncovering new information about Adrian's dealings. Cole set a thick file on the table, the papers inside barely held together by a single clip. "Here's what I've got so far," he began, his tone serious. "Adrian's been working with a private developer, Ridgeway Partners. They're notorious for underhanded tactics, bribing city officials, using forged documents to expedite permits, and even threatening community leaders who oppose their projects. Megan frowned as she skimmed the first few pages. "And we think this is connected to St. Bernadette." "No doubt about it," Cole replied. "Ridgway has already filed preliminary plans with the city council, using Adrian's name as the primary sponsor. It's all happening under the radar because they don't want public backlash until the deal is finalized." Grace, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. "If this goes through, St. Bernadette is as good as gone. What can we do to stop it?" Julian tapped his fingers on the table, his mind racing. "We need to expose them before they solidify their position. If we can prove that Ridgway and Adrian are operating unethically, we can stall the project and force the board to reconsider." Megan looked skeptical. "But how?" "Adrian's careful. He won't leave anything obvious for us to find." "That's where I come in," Cole said, a small smirk playing on his lips. "I've been looking into Ridgway's financials, and there are some irregularities, offshore accounts, shell companies, the usual tricks. If we dig deeper, we might find something solid enough to take to the authorities." Julian nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Good. But we need more than just financial discrepancies. We need public support. If the community rallies behind the shelter, it'll be harder for the board to ignore the backlash." Grace chimed in, her voice steady and determined. "We can organize a rally, get the residents, volunteers, and anyone else who cares about St. Bernadette to show up and make their voices heard." "That's a start," Julian said, "but we need to control the narrative. Adrian's already got the media spinning this as a progressive redevelopment. If we don't counter that, we'll lose before we even begin." Megan scribbled notes on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "I'll reach out to some journalists I trust. If we can get them to run a story about Ridgway's history, it might shift public opinion." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the enormity of what they were up against. Julian glanced at Cole. "How much time do we have before this goes to the city council?" "Not much," Cole admitted. "A week, maybe less." Julian exhaled sharply, his mind already calculating the next steps. "Then we move fast. Cole, keep digging into Ridgway. Megan, work on the media angle. Grace, let's get that rally organized. We don't have room for mistakes." As the meeting adjourned, Julian felt a strange mix of determination and apprehension. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, he felt like he had a team behind him, a group of people just as committed to saving St. Bernadette as he was. Now, it was a race against time to ensure that their efforts would be enough. The following days were a blur of activity as Julian and his makeshift team sprang into action. Grace took charge of rally preparations, working closely with the residents and volunteers at St. Bernadette Shelter. The shelter's courtyard became a hive of activity as banners were painted, speeches drafted, and logistics finalized. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and support began pouring in from local businesses and community groups. Julian, meanwhile, focused on the corporate front. With Megan's help, he compiled a dossier on Ridgway partners and their shady practices. Every late night and skipped meal only fueled his resolve. The more he learned, the clearer it became that Adrian and Ridgway were banking on the shelter's lack of resources to push their agenda through uncontested. At the shelter, Sienna was everywhere at once, organizing supplies, meeting with local leaders, and comforting residents who feared the worst. Julian often found himself watching her from a distance, struck by her unwavering commitment. It was in these moments that he understood just how much he'd underestimated her, and how much he still admired her. On the evening before the rally, Detective Cole arrived at the shelter with a guarded expression and a laptop under his arm. He motioned for Julian and Megan to join him in the small office near the dining hall. The room was cramped, and the tension was palpable as Cole opened his laptop and brought up a series of documents. "This is what I've found," Cole began, his tone serious. Ridgeway Partners funneled money through 2 shell companies to bribe members of the city council. The payments line up perfectly with the timeline of their redevelopment proposals. Julian leaned forward, his eyes scanning the screen. "Do we have proof? Something that will hold up under scrutiny?" Cole nodded. "These are bank statements, wire transfers, and even emails between Adrian and Ridgeway executives. It's more than enough to expose them." Megan let out a low whistle. "This is explosive. If this gets out, it could derail the entire project." "But we have to be strategic," Cole cautioned. "If we release this without a plan, Ridgeway could spin it or bury it before it gains traction. Timing is everything." Julian nodded, his mind racing. "We'll release it during the rally. With the press already there and the community watching, they won't be able to hide from this." As the team finalized their plan, Julian couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time, they had real leverage against Adrian and Ridgeway, but he knew the fight was far from over. Tomorrow's rally would be their moment to shift the tide, and failure wasn't an option. The next morning, the courtyard of St. Bernadette Shelter was transformed into a sea of people. Residents, volunteers, and supporters filled every available space, holding signs that read, "Save our shelter" and "People over profits." Local media crews set up cameras, their lenses trained on the stage where Sienna stood, flanked by Grace and other shelter leaders. Julian watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding as the energy in the crowd built to a crescendo. When Sienna stepped up to the microphone, the noise quieted, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. "This shelter is more than just walls and a roof," Sienna began, her voice steady and clear. "It's a lifeline for people who have been forgotten, ignored, and pushed aside. We're here today to say that we won't let that happen. Not now, not ever." The crowd erupted into applause, and Julian felt a swell of pride as he watched Sienna command the moment. As the rally continued, he prepared for his part of the plan. When the time came, he stepped onto the stage, earning murmurs of surprise from the crowd. "Many of you know me as the CEO of Crosstech," Julian began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But today, I'm here not as a businessman, but as someone who believes in this community and the people it serves." He held up a stack of papers, Cole's evidence, and the cameras zoomed in. "What I'm holding here is proof that the redevelopment project isn't about progress, it's about greed. Ridgeway Partners and Adrian Shaw have been bribing officials to push this through, regardless of what it costs this community." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of outrage. Journalists scrambled to take notes and snap photos as Julian handed the documents to a reporter in the front row. "This is the truth," he said, "and it's time we hold them accountable." The crowd roared in approval, their chants echoing through the neighborhood. Julian stepped back, his heart racing as the momentum of the rally surged. He knew they had taken a crucial step, but the fight was far from over. The next battle would be in the court of public opinion, and possibly the legal system, but for the first time, Julian felt they had a real chance at victory. The aftermath of the rally was a whirlwind of activity. News outlets were flooded with footage of Julian's speech and the damning evidence against Ridgeway Partners. Social media erupted with hashtags like Rasa Saves Bernadette and People Over Profits, sparking a wave of public outcry. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning in their favor. At the shelter, the atmosphere was a mix of cautious optimism and mounting pressure. Sienna had barely sat down since the rally, her phone constantly buzzing with calls from reporters, community leaders, and supporters. Julian had become a fixture at the shelter, working alongside volunteers and strategizing with the team to keep the momentum going. In a quiet corner of the shelter's office, Julian and Detective Cole pored over the latest developments. Cole had been following up on the documents they had exposed, and his findings were more damning than they could have hoped. "Ridgway's scrambling," Cole said, pointing to a set of emails he had intercepted. "They're trying to cut ties with Adrian, but it's too late. The City Council's Ethics Committee has already opened an investigation." Julian nodded, but his expression was far from celebratory. "That's a good start, but we're not out of the woods yet. Adrian won't go down without a fight." Cole smirked. "No, he won't. But the pressure's on him now, and he knows it." As they spoke, Sienna entered the room, looking both exhausted and determined. She dropped a stack of papers on the table and crossed her arms. "We've got a problem," she said, her tone clipped. Julian straightened. "What is it?" "The City Council just scheduled a hearing for the redevelopment project," Sienna explained. "It's happening in 3 days. They're claiming it's routine, but we all know this is Adrian trying to push it through before the investigation gets too far." Cole frowned. "That's fast. Too fast." "Exactly," Sienna said. "If they vote in favor of the project, it won't matter what evidence we have. Once the permits are approved, stopping the demolition will be nearly impossible." Julian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Then we need to make sure they don't vote in favor." "That's easier said than done," Sienna replied. "Adrian's had months, maybe years, to line up his supporters on the council. We're coming in late, and the odds aren't in our favor." Julian met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "We've beaten the odds before. We can do it again." Sienna sighed but nodded. "Fine, but we're going to need a lot more than just public support. We need to hit them where it hurts, financially, politically, whatever it takes." Cole tapped the stack of papers Sienna had brought in. "What's in here?" "Lists of council members, their voting records, their campaign donors," Sienna said. "If Adrian's been bribing people, we need to find out who's involved." Julian picked up one of the papers, scanning it quickly. "This is good. If we can tie any of these names to Ridgway's money, we can force them to recuse themselves from the vote." "And if we can't?" Sienna asked, her voice heavy with doubt. "Then we find another way," Julian said firmly. "We're not letting this happen." The next 2 days were a blur of preparation and investigation. Julian, Sienna, Grace, and Cole worked tirelessly, dividing tasks and pooling their resources to uncover any connections between the City Council and Ridgway partners. Megan, still operating from Crosstech, used her corporate network to dig into campaign donations and financial statements, sending updates to the team in real time. Grace took charge of rallying the community once more. She coordinated with local leaders, encouraging them to attend the hearing and make their voices heard. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, urging residents to show up and speak out against the redevelopment project. The shelter became a hive of activity, filled with volunteers and supporters determined to save their home. Julian focused on the council members themselves. Using the documents Sienna had compiled, he reached out to a few allies within the city's political circles. Among them was Councilwoman Ramirez, a vocal advocate for affordable housing and social programs. She had been skeptical of Julian at first, but after the rally, she agreed to meet with him. In a small cafe near City Hall, Ramirez listened intently as Julian explained the situation. He laid out the evidence against Ridgway and Adrian, emphasizing the devastating impact the redevelopment would have on the community. "This is compelling," Ramirez admitted, tapping her pen against the table. "But it's going to take more than this to sway the council. Adrian has deep pockets, and some of my colleagues aren't exactly immune to persuasion." Julian leaned forward, his tone resolute. "Then we need to make it clear that voting for this project isn't just bad policy. It's political suicide. The community is paying attention now, and the media won't let this go quietly." Ramirez nodded slowly. "If you can pack the hearing with supporters and get the press involved, it'll send a strong message. I'll do what I can to rally other council members who are on the fence. Thank you, Julian said sincerely. We can't do this without you. As the meeting ended, Julian felt a surge of hope. Ramirez's support was a critical step, but there was still so much to do. Back at the shelter, he found Sienna in the office, poring over a list of council members with Cole. How did it go? She asked without looking up. Ramirez is on board, Julian replied. She's willing to help sway the undecided votes. Sienna glanced up, a flicker of relief in her expression. That's something, at least. But we still need to figure out who Adrian's got in his pocket. Cole looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. I think I've found one. Councilman Barrett. He's received multiple donations from a PAC tied to Ridgway. It's not direct, but it's enough to raise questions. Sienna frowned. Is it enough to force him to recuse himself? Maybe, Cole said, but we'd need to present it in the right way. If we come out swinging without solid proof, it could backfire. Julian nodded. Then we handle it carefully. If Barrett is compromised, we need to make sure everyone knows it. As the hearing approached, the team worked late into the night, refining their strategy and preparing for every possible scenario. By the time the day of the hearing arrived, they were exhausted but ready. City Hall was packed when Julian and Sienna arrived, the air thick with anticipation. Supporters of the shelter filled the seats, their signs and banners creating a sea of color and determination. Reporters lined the walls, cameras trained on the council members as they filed in. Adrian Shaw sat confidently at a table near the front, flanked by Ridgway executives. He barely acknowledged Julian as they crossed paths, but his smug expression spoke volumes. To him, this was a done deal. Sienna leaned close to Julian as they took their seats. Are you ready for this? Julian met her gaze, his expression steady. More than ever. As the hearing began, the council members called for public comments. One by one, residents and volunteers from St. Bernadette stood up, sharing heartfelt stories about how the shelter had changed their lives. Their voices were raw with emotion, and the impact was undeniable. Even the most stoic council members seemed moved. When it was Julian's turn to speak, he stood and faced the council with the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to lose. He laid out the evidence against Ridgway and Adrian, pointing to the documents Cole had uncovered and the connections Megan had traced. He emphasized the human cost of the project, painting a vivid picture of what the community would lose if the shelter were demolished. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with murmurs of support. Ramirez followed with a powerful statement of her own, calling on the council to prioritize the needs of the community over corporate greed. Adrian, clearly rattled, made a last-ditch attempt to defend the project, but the damage had been done. As the council prepared to deliberate, Julian felt a flicker of hope. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the council to decide. The council chamber fell silent as the last speaker finished, their emotional plea lingering in the air. The stories shared by St. Bernadette's supporters had struck a chord, but the decision wasn't made yet. The council members huddled in quiet discussion at the head of the room, their faces a mix of contemplation and tension. Julian sat beside Sienna, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. I think we made an impact, Sienna whispered, her voice barely audible over the buzz of quiet murmurs in the room. Julian nodded, but didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on Adrian, who was seated a few rows away. Unlike his earlier display of confidence, Adrian now seemed less certain. His posture was rigid, and his whispered exchanges with Ridgway's representatives betrayed his unease. The council chairwoman called for order, and the room fell into an expectant hush. The council will now deliberate on the redevelopment proposal for St. Bernadette Shelter, she announced. Please remain seated as we proceed. The deliberations began, each council member presenting their arguments. Councilwoman Ramirez was one of the first to speak, her voice firm and unwavering. "This shelter is more than a building," she said, addressing the room. "It's a cornerstone of this community, providing support and safety for those who have nowhere else to turn. Destroying it for a high-rise development would be an unforgivable loss." A ripple of applause broke out before the chairwoman's gavel silenced it. The next speaker, a councilman whose ties to Ridgeway were less clear, took a more measured tone. "While I sympathize with the concerns raised today," he said, "we must also consider the long-term economic benefits of redevelopment. Projects like these can bring new opportunities to neighborhoods in need." Julian exchanged a glance with Sienna, the tension between them palpable. The debate continued, each argument tipping the scales back and forth. Support for the shelter was strong, but the council remained divided, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. At one point, Councilman Barrett, the member Cole had flagged as having suspicious ties to Ridgeway, took the floor. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen. "I believe we need to look at this matter objectively," he said. "Progress often comes with difficult decisions, but it's our responsibility to prioritize the future." Julian's jaw tightened. Barrett's carefully neutral stance was exactly what they had feared. It was clear he wasn't going to recuse himself voluntarily, and his vote could tip the balance. Cole, who had been seated in the back of the room, leaned forward, catching Julian's eye. With a subtle nod, he pulled out his phone and began typing. Moments later, Julian's phone buzzed with a message. "Ready to move if you give the word." Julian hesitated, his mind racing. They had hoped to avoid exposing Barrett's connections unless absolutely necessary, but the stakes were too high to hold back now. He glanced at Sienna, who met his gaze with a knowing look. "Do it," she said quietly. Julian nodded and sent a quick reply to Cole. Seconds later, Cole stood, his voice cutting through the deliberations. "Excuse me, Councilwoman," he said, addressing the chairwoman. "If I may, I have evidence that needs to be presented immediately." The room buzzed with whispers as Cole walked to the front, holding a manila folder. The chairwoman raised an eyebrow, but nodded for him to proceed. Cole handed the folder to the council's legal advisor, who quickly scanned its contents. "This folder contains financial records and correspondence that link Councilman Barrett to Ridgeway Partners," Cole explained, his tone calm but firm. "The documents suggest a direct conflict of interest that compromises his ability to vote impartially on this matter." The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber. Barrett's face turned pale, and he stammered a denial, but the damage was done. The chairwoman called for a brief recess to review the evidence, and the room erupted into frantic murmurs as the council members exited. Julian exhaled, his heart pounding. "That was a bold move," Sienna said, her voice laced with a mix of admiration and worry. "It had to be done," Julian replied. "Now we just have to hope it's enough." The recess stretched on longer than anyone anticipated, leaving the room steeped in uneasy tension. Supporters of the shelter whispered anxiously among themselves, their voices low but filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Julian paced near the back of the chamber, his mind replaying every moment of the hearing and every word of Cole's bold revelation. He had no doubt that Barrett's ties to Ridgeway were real, but he worried whether the council would act decisively or sweep the matter under the rug. Sienna stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly as she watched the city beyond. The normally vibrant energy she carried seemed dimmed, weighed down by the enormity of what was at stake. Julian approached her, his steps hesitant. "We've done everything we can," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Now it's in their hands." Sienna turned to him, her eyes filled with a guarded hope. "It's just, Hard to trust that the system will do the right thing. People like Adrian always seem to find a way to win. Julian nodded, understanding her doubt. "This time feels different," he said, glancing at the crowd of supporters filling the room. "Look at them. This community isn't going to let this go. No matter what happens, we're not done fighting." Before Sienna could reply, the council members began filing back into the chamber. The chairwoman's gavel brought the room to order, and everyone returned to their seats, anticipation thick in the air. "The council has reviewed the evidence presented regarding Councilman Barrett's connections to Ridgeway Partners," the chairwoman announced. Her tone was firm, her expression unreadable. "As this evidence raises significant concerns about impartiality, Councilman Barrett will be recused from voting on this matter." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, followed by scattered applause from the shelter's supporters. Julian allowed himself a brief moment of relief, though he knew the battle was far from over. "With Councilman Barrett recused, the remaining members will now cast their votes," the chairwoman continued. "A simple majority will determine the outcome." The roll call began, each council member standing to cast their vote. The first few votes split down predictable lines, supporters of the shelter on one side, proponents of redevelopment on the other. The tension grew with every name called, the tally inching closer to a tie. When Ramirez's turn came, she rose with calm confidence. "I vote against the redevelopment," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The shelter's supporters erupted into applause, only to be quickly silenced by the gavel. As the final votes approached, the outcome hung in the balance. Julian gripped the edge of his seat, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then came the pivotal moment. A council member who had been undecided stood, glancing around the room before speaking. "I vote against the redevelopment," he said firmly. The room erupted into cheers, the weight of the moment crashing down on everyone present. Sienna covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes as the realization sank in. St. Bernadette Shelter had won. The chairwoman raised her gavel, struggling to restore order as supporters celebrated. "The motion to approve the redevelopment is denied," she declared. "This hearing is adjourned." The chamber erupted into chaos, but this time it was the joyous kind. Sienna turned to Julian, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You did it," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We did it," Julian corrected, his own voice unsteady. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not from closing a deal or signing a contract, but from standing up for something that truly mattered. As the crowd spilled out onto the steps of City Hall, Julian stood beside Sienna, watching the community celebrate their victory. The fight against Ridgeway wasn't entirely over. There were still legal battles to be fought and repairs to be made, but for now they had won a crucial victory. And in that moment, Julian knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The celebration at City Hall spilled out onto the surrounding streets, a spontaneous outpouring of joy and relief. Supporters of St. Bernadette Shelter hugged one another, their cheers echoing into the early evening air. Sienna stood at the center of the crowd, her usually composed demeanor softened by the weight of the moment. She accepted the congratulations with grace, but her eyes kept drifting toward Julian, who lingered at the edge of the gathering. Julian watched from a slight distance, his hands tucked into his pockets. The satisfaction of their victory was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't truly over. Ridgeway and Adrian Shaw weren't the type to walk away quietly, and he knew retaliation was inevitable. Still, for now, he allowed himself to take in the sight of the community standing united, a stark contrast to the fractured corporate world he had inhabited for so long. Sienna approached him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "You should be out there celebrating," she said, motioning to the crowd. "I think you got that covered," Julian replied with a small smile. Besides, this is your moment. Sienna shook her head. It's not just mine. We wouldn't have made it this far without you. I didn't expect any of this. Julian met her gaze, his voice steady. You've always underestimated me. Sienna let out a soft laugh, but there was warmth in her eyes. Maybe I have, but you've proven me wrong. Before Julian could respond, Detective Cole appeared, his expression serious. Sorry to interrupt, he said, glancing between them. But we need to talk. Sienna's demeanor shifted immediately, her posture straightening. What is it? Cole held up his phone, showing a text message. I just got word from a contact at Ridgeway. Adrian's not backing down. He's already planning his next move. Julian's jaw tightened. What kind of move? Legal action, Cole said grimly. He's claiming procedural errors in the council's decision and threatening to sue the city to overturn the vote. He's also talking about filing an injunction to freeze the shelter's operations. Sienna's face hardened, the triumph of the afternoon fading into renewed determination. So he's trying to starve us out. Typical. Julian nodded, his mind racing. He's counting on dragging this out until the shelter can't sustain itself. If we lose momentum, we're done. Cole crossed his arms. I'll keep digging, but we need to be ready. Adrian's playing dirty and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. Sienna looked to Julian, her voice firm. We won't let that happen. We've come too far to give up now. Agreed, Julian said. We need to strengthen our position. That means doubling down on public support and finding allies who can back us legally and financially. Grace, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. I'll start reaching out to our network. There are plenty of people in this city who won't stand for this kind of corruption. Good, Sienna said, nodding. And we'll need to prepare for whatever Adrian throws at us next. This isn't just about saving the shelter anymore. It's about making sure no one like him can ever do this again. Julian couldn't help but admire her resolve, even as the weight of their situation pressed down on him. They had won a critical battle, but the war was far from over. And this time, the stakes were even higher. As the crowd began to disperse, Julian stayed behind with Sienna and Cole, sketching out the beginnings of their next plan. The light from City Hall cast long shadows across the steps, a reminder that their work was far from finished. But as Julian looked at the faces around him, Sienna's unwavering determination, Cole's quiet confidence, and Grace's fierce loyalty, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for a building, they were fighting for a community, a future, and perhaps even redemption. The following morning, the shelter buzzed with a heightened sense of urgency. Volunteers moved with renewed purpose, organizing supplies and preparing for the challenges ahead. Sienna had called an emergency meeting with Julian, Cole, Grace, and a few trusted allies from the community. They gathered in the dining hall, which had been transformed into a makeshift strategy room. We need to act fast, Sienna began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Adrian's already making moves to undermine us, and we can't afford to wait for him to gain ground. Grace nodded, spreading a map of the city across the table. I've started contacting local leaders and organizations who've supported us in the past. Most of them are on board to help, but they'll need clear direction on how they can contribute. Julian leaned over the table, scanning the map. Public support is our strongest weapon right now. If we keep the community engaged and informed, it'll make it harder for Adrian to manipulate the narrative. Agreed, Cole said. But we also need to prepare for his legal attacks. I've already reached out to a few attorneys who specialize in cases like this. They're willing to help, but they'll need funding to take on a case this big. Sienna frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. The shelter's resources are already stretched thin. We can't afford a prolonged legal battle. Julian straightened, his expression resolute. Then we'll find the funding elsewhere. I'll reach out to my contacts in the corporate and philanthropic world. There are people out there who care about this community, people with the resources to make a difference. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of his words. Sienna looked at Julian, her gaze searching. You're willing to put yourself on the line for this? Your reputation? Your connections? Absolutely, Julian said without hesitation. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's ours. Sienna's lips quirked into the faintest of smiles, but the determination in her eyes remained unwavering. Then let's get to work. Over the next few hours, the group divided their responsibilities and set their plans into motion. Grace coordinated with local businesses and community leaders to organize a series of fundraisers, including a benefit concert featuring well-known local musicians. Cole focused on gathering evidence to counter Adrian's legal maneuvers, determined to uncover every shady deal and unethical practice Ridgway had engaged in. Julian returned to his office at Crosstech, where Megan had already begun compiling a list of potential donors and allies. "This is going to be a tough sell," she warned as Julian reviewed the list. "A lot of these people are risk-averse. They won't want to get involved in something this messy." Julian looked up from the papers, his expression firm. "Then we focus on the ones who will. We don't need everyone, we just need enough." Megan nodded, her respect for Julian's determination clear. "All right, let's make some calls." As the day wore on, the shelter's network grew stronger. Local media picked up the story, highlighting the shelter's plight and the community's efforts to fight back. Support poured in from unexpected places: a retired judge who offered legal counsel, a small restaurant owner who donated profits from a day's sales, and even a group of high school students who organized a car wash to raise funds. By evening, the shelter's courtyard was filled with a mix of residents, volunteers, and supporters. Sienna stood at the center, her clipboard in hand as she coordinated the day's efforts. Despite the challenges ahead, there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense of unity and resilience that couldn't be shaken. Julian watched from the sidelines, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had spent so much of his life chasing profits and prestige, but standing here, surrounded by people fighting for something greater than themselves, he felt a deeper sense of fulfillment than he ever had in a boardroom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courtyard in a warm, golden glow, Sienna approached him, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "You've done a lot for us," she said quietly. "For me. I just wanted you to know that I see it, and I appreciate it." Julian met her gaze, his voice steady. "This isn't about me, Sienna. It's about what's right. But thank you." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the noise of the bustling courtyard fading into the background. It was a brief reprieve in the midst of chaos, a reminder of what they were fighting for. As the lights in the courtyard flickered on and the preparations continued late into the night, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle against Adrian and Ridgway was far from over, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. Julian stood in the conference room at Crosstech, his eyes fixed on the large monitor displaying a spreadsheet filled with names, numbers, and connections. Megan clicked through slides as she presented their progress on gathering financial and legal support for the shelter. Despite the late hour, Julian's mind was sharp, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and determination. "We've secured commitments from several donors," Megan said, pointing to a highlighted column. "Altogether, it's enough to cover legal fees for the next few months, plus a reserve for emergency operations at the shelter." Julian nodded. "Good. What about the public campaign?" Megan switched to another slide, this one showing graphs of social media engagement and donation trends. The response has been overwhelming. The hashtag number sign, Save St. Bernadette, is still trending, and local influencers have started amplifying our message. We're gaining traction, but it's critical we keep the momentum going. Julian leaned back, absorbing the information. We'll need to time everything perfectly. Ridgway and Adrian are going to hit back hard, and we can't afford to lose the narrative. As if on cue, Julian's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen. Detective Cole. Julian answered, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "Cole, what do you have?" "Something big," Cole replied, his tone urgent. "I've been digging into Ridgway's recent activities, and it looks like they're funneling money to a shell company that's tied to a key city official. This official happens to oversee building permits and zoning approvals." Julian's grip tightened on the phone. "Do we have proof?" "Enough to cause a stir," Cole said. "I've got the wire transfers and a series of emails linking Adrian to the scheme. It's messy, but it's damning." Julian glanced at Megan, who was watching him closely. "Send me everything," he said. "We'll need to strategize how to use it." As the call ended, Julian shared the news with Megan, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "This could be the turning point," she said. "If we expose this publicly, it could cripple Ridgway and Adrian's entire operation." "Exactly," Julian agreed, "but we have to be careful. Timing is everything, and we need to coordinate with the legal team to make sure this sticks." The weight of their next move settled heavily on Julian as he walked to the window, looking out at the city below. In the distance, the faint glow of St. Bernadette Shelter's lights was just visible, a reminder of what they were fighting for. He thought of Sienna and the people who depended on the shelter, their lives hanging in the balance of this battle. The stakes had never been higher, and failure wasn't an option. Later that evening, Julian arrived at the shelter to brief Sienna and the team on Cole's findings. The dining hall had been transformed into a war room once again, with maps, charts, and papers covering every available surface. Sienna looked up from a stack of documents as Julian entered, her expression a mix of weariness and resolve. "What's the update?" she asked. Julian handed her a folder containing the evidence. Cole found a direct link between Ridgway, Adrian, and a city official overseeing permits. "If we play this right, we can not only stop Adrian but also expose the corruption that's been fueling this entire project." Sienna flipped through the folder, her jaw tightening as she absorbed the details. "This is huge," she said, "but it's also dangerous. If we go public with this, they'll come after us even harder." "We don't have a choice," Julian said firmly. "This is our best chance to shut them down for good." Sienna met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finding none, she nodded. "All right, let's do it." The following morning, the plan went into motion. Julian and Sienna stood side by side in the shelter's courtyard, addressing a small group of reporters who had gathered for an impromptu press conference. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow over the crowd of supporters who had come to witness the latest development in the fight for St. Bernadette. Sienna stepped up to the microphone first, her voice steady and strong despite the gravity of the moment. "For too long, the voices of this community have been ignored," she began. "Today, we're here to expose the truth about the forces trying to tear down this shelter. This isn't about progress or redevelopment. It's about greed and corruption." She gestured to Julian, who stepped forward with a folder in hand. The reporters leaned in, their cameras and recorders capturing every word. "What you're about to see are documents that link Ridgway Partners and Adrian Shaw to unethical and likely illegal practices," Julian said. "These include bribes to city officials and fraudulent permits designed to fast-track the destruction of this shelter." He held up copies of the documents, passing them to the journalists in the front row. The ripple of shock was palpable as the reporters flipped through the evidence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Julian continued, his tone unwavering. "We're calling on the City Council to launch a full investigation into Ridgeway Partners and Adrian Shaw. This isn't just about Saint Bernadette. It's about protecting the integrity of this city and the people who call it home." As Julian stepped back, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. The reporters immediately began firing off questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Sienna handled the questions with grace, reiterating the shelter's commitment to fighting for justice and transparency. Behind the scenes, Grace and Megan worked to ensure the story spread far and wide. Within hours, headlines plastered local news outlets, and social media was ablaze with reactions. The evidence against Ridgeway and Adrian quickly became the talk of the city, putting immense pressure on the council to respond. But the victory was short-lived. By midday, Adrian Shaw had issued a statement, denying all allegations and accusing Julian and Sienna of fabricating the evidence to protect their outdated and inefficient shelter. His words were calculated and sharp, designed to cast doubt and muddy the waters. Julian read Adrian's statement with a clenched jaw, his frustration mounting. "He's doubling down," he said, tossing the printout onto the table in the shelter's office. "Of course he is," Sienna replied, her tone clipped. "That's what people like him do. They lie and manipulate because they think they're untouchable." "He won't get away with it," Julian said. "Not this time." Detective Cole entered the room then, carrying a USB drive. "Good news," he said, his smirk betraying his satisfaction. "I just got off the phone with the state attorney's office. They're taking this seriously. With the evidence we've provided, they're opening an official investigation into Ridgeway and Adrian." The tension in the room lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Sienna looked at Cole, her eyes wide. "You're sure?" Cole nodded. "They're not making any promises, but this is a strong case. Adrian's going to have a hard time talking his way out of this." Julian exhaled, the weight on his shoulders easing slightly. "It's a start," he said, "but we need to stay vigilant. Adrian's not going to go down without a fight." As the day wore on, the shelter became a hub of activity. Supporters continued to pour in, offering donations, legal advice, and manpower. The momentum they had built was undeniable, but so was the resistance they faced. Late that evening, Julian found himself back in the shelter's courtyard, the chaos of the day giving way to a rare moment of quiet. Sienna joined him, her steps soft as she approached. "You've done a lot," she said, her voice carrying a note of gratitude. "More than I ever expected." Julian looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "So have you. None of this would have been possible without your strength." For a moment they stood in silence, the faint hum of the city around them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time Julian felt a sense of certainty. They were on the right path, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The storm hit harder than expected. By the next morning, Adrian Shaw had escalated his counterattack, filing an emergency injunction to freeze the shelter's operations under the guise of safety concerns. The move blindsided the team, sending a ripple of frustration and anxiety through the shelter. "This is a desperate play," Julian said, pacing the length of the office. His expression was a mixture of determination and anger. "He's trying to choke us out while the legal case is still unfolding." Sienna, seated at the desk with her phone pressed to her ear, ended her call with a frustrated sigh. "The court is hearing the injunction tomorrow. If they grant it, the shelter will have to shut down temporarily. That could undo everything we've worked for." Julian stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "Then we can't let that happen. What's our next move?" Grace entered the room, her expression grim but resolute. "We fight back," she said, dropping a folder on the desk. "I've been working with Cole and our legal team all night. We've prepared a counter-argument, but it's going to come down to how much weight the judge gives to Adrian's claims versus our evidence." Sienna flipped through the folder, her brow furrowing as she read. "This is solid, but we need more. We need people in that courtroom. Residents, supporters, anyone who can testify to what this shelter means." "I'll make some calls," Grace said, already pulling out her phone. "If we can rally enough people, it'll show the court that this isn't just a legal issue, it's a matter of public interest." Julian nodded, his mind racing. "We also need to get ahead of the media. If Adrian controls the narrative, it'll sway public perception, and that could influence the judge. Megan's already working on another press release, but we need someone who can speak directly to the heart of this fight." Sienna looked up, meeting Julian's gaze. "You?" Julian blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Me? You've been at the forefront of this from the start," Sienna said firmly. "People listen to you, Julian. They see that you're not just some corporate executive anymore, you're fighting for them. That matters." Julian hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. For so long he had avoided the spotlight, content to let others take the lead. But now, as he looked around the room at the people who had become his team, his family, he realized there was no turning back. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Julian and Megan coordinated with local media outlets, arranging interviews and ensuring the story stayed in the public eye. Sienna and Grace worked tirelessly to gather testimonies from shelter residents and community leaders, compiling a powerful case to present in court. Meanwhile, Cole continued digging into Ridgway's dealings, determined to uncover anything that could tip the scales further in their favor. By nightfall, the shelter was buzzing with energy and anticipation. Volunteers prepared signs and banners for a peaceful demonstration outside the courthouse, while others worked late into the night, finalizing documents and preparing witnesses. Despite the chaos, there was a palpable sense of unity, a shared determination to see this fight through to the end. Julian sat in a quiet corner of the shelter's office, reviewing his notes for the media interviews scheduled for the next morning. Sienna entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of him and sat across the desk, her expression softer than it had been all day. "You've come a long way," she said, her tone laced with both admiration and surprise. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed you'd be here doing all of this." Julian met her gaze, his own filled with sincerity. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed it either. But this fight, it's changed me, and it's made me realize what I should have been fighting for all along." Sienna nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Well, don't lose that fire tomorrow. We're going to need it." "I won't," Julian promised. "We're in this together." As the night stretched on, Julian felt a rare sense of clarity. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, the steps of the courthouse were alive with energy. A crowd had gathered, holding signs emblazoned with messages like "Save St. Bernadette" and "Justice for our community." Reporters moved through the crowd, capturing the moment while volunteers handed out flyers detailing the shelter's story and the evidence against Ridgway partners. Julian stood at the edge of the crowd, adjusting his tie as Megan finished briefing him. "The media's ready," she said, motioning toward the microphones and cameras set up near the entrance. "This is your chance to control the narrative before we step inside." He nodded, his usual boardroom confidence tempered by the weight of the moment. As he walked toward the podium, the crowd quieted, their collective gaze fixed on him. Julian took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Good morning," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Today, we stand at a crossroads, not just for St. Bernadette Shelter, but for our entire community. This shelter isn't just a building, It's a lifeline for people who have nowhere else to turn. It represents hope, resilience, and the belief that no one should be left behind. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. The actions of Ridgway Partners and Adrian Shaw threaten not only this shelter, but also the integrity of our city. Their greed has led to corruption and deceit, all in the name of profit. But we're here to say that enough is enough. This community deserves better, and we won't stop fighting until justice is served. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the courthouse walls. Julian stepped back, letting Sienna take the podium. Her speech was shorter, but no less powerful, a heartfelt plea for the court to see the shelter for what it truly was, a beacon of hope in a city that desperately needed it. As the crowd continued to cheer, Julian and Sienna made their way inside, accompanied by their legal team and Detective Cole. The courtroom was already packed, with Adrian and his lawyers seated at one table and the shelter's team at the other. The tension was palpable as the judge entered, calling the proceedings to order. Adrian's lawyer was the first to speak, delivering a polished argument about safety concerns and the urgent need for redevelopment. It was a carefully crafted narrative, designed to mask Ridgway's true intentions and paint the shelter as a liability. But when the shelter's lawyer stood, the tone of the room shifted. Armed with Cole's evidence and the testimonies of residents, the argument was clear and compelling. The lawyer methodically dismantled Adrian's claims, exposing the corruption and greed that underpinned the redevelopment project. As the proceedings continued, Julian and Sienna watched intently, their emotions a mix of hope and apprehension. Every statement, every piece of evidence felt like a critical step toward deciding the shelter's fate. The climax of the hearing came when Cole took the stand. His testimony was precise and devastating, detailing the financial schemes and underhanded tactics Ridgway had employed. The room hung on his every word, and by the time he finished, even Adrian looked shaken. When the hearing adjourned for the day, the shelter's team emerged to a crowd still waiting outside. The energy was electric, fueled by a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. "You were incredible," Sienna said to Julian as they walked toward the waiting reporters. "I don't know how you do it." Julian smiled, his expression both humble and determined. "I had a good reason to step up." As they addressed the press once more, Julian felt a growing sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he truly believed they could win. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge to deliver the ruling. The air was thick with tension, every eye in the room fixed on the bench where the judge sat, flipping through the final pages of notes. Julian glanced toward Sienna, who sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't meet his gaze, her focus entirely on the moment at hand. Adrian Shaw, seated at the opposing table, leaned back in his chair with a carefully composed expression, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. His legal team sat rigidly beside him, their earlier confidence having faltered under the weight of the evidence presented. The judge finally cleared his throat, setting the papers down. "This court has carefully reviewed the arguments and evidence presented by both sides," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "The redevelopment of St. Bernadette Shelter raises significant concerns, not only about its impact on the community, but also regarding the ethical conduct of Ridgway Partners and its associates." Julian felt his breath catch as the judge continued. "The evidence provided demonstrates a troubling pattern of misconduct, including financial irregularities and unethical influence over city officials. These actions undermine the credibility of the redevelopment proposal and violate the principles of transparency and accountability expected in such matters." Adrian's calm facade cracked, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. The judge turned his attention directly to him. As such, this court denies the request for an injunction against St. Bernadette Shelter and calls for an independent investigation into Ridgway Partners' activities. A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Sienna exhaled sharply, her shoulders slumping with relief. Julian felt an overwhelming surge of triumph, but kept his expression measured, knowing the fight wasn't entirely over yet. The judge continued, "Furthermore, this court recommends that the City Council reconsider its stance on future redevelopment projects, prioritizing transparency and community impact." The gavel struck, signaling the conclusion of the hearing. For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then, as the realization sank in, the supporters of St. Bernadette Shelter erupted into cheers. Julian turned to Sienna, who had tears glistening in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "We did it," he said quietly. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "We did." Adrian stood abruptly, muttering something to his legal team before storming out of the courtroom. The sight was oddly satisfying, though Julian knew they had to remain vigilant. Ridgway wasn't completely defeated, but their credibility and Adrian's power had taken a massive hit. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters waited anxiously for news. When Sienna and Julian emerged, the announcement of their victory was met with a deafening roar of applause and cheers. Cameras flashed and reporters swarmed, but all Julian could focus on was the sheer joy radiating from the community they had fought so hard to protect. Sienna stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "This victory belongs to all of us," she said, "to everyone who stood up, who spoke out, and who refused to back down. St. Bernadette Shelter is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their voices echoing through the streets. As Sienna stepped back, Julian joined her, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the crowd outside the courthouse began to disperse, the sense of victory lingered in the air. Sienna and Julian stayed back, taking a moment to absorb the enormity of what they had accomplished. The shelter had been saved, and Ridgway's corruption was exposed. The fight had been long and grueling, but standing here now, it felt worth every second. "We still have a lot of work ahead of us," Sienna said, her voice thoughtful as she glanced at the reporters packing up their gear. "The investigation into Ridgway isn't over, and we need to make sure the shelter stays strong." Julian nodded. "You're right. But today, we take a breath. You've earned it, Sienna." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "So have you." Back at St. Bernadette Shelter, the celebration continued. Volunteers, residents and supporters gathered in the courtyard, sharing laughter and stories. Music played from a portable speaker, and children ran through the crowd with uncontainable energy. It was a stark contrast to the tension and uncertainty that had weighed on the shelter for so long. Julian found himself sitting on one of the benches, a cup of coffee in hand, as he watched the scene unfold. Grace joined him, her expression lighter than usual. "Not bad for a corporate guy," she said, nudging him with her elbow. Julian chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," Grace said, her tone softening. "You stepped up when it mattered, and this place is better for it. I think Sienna sees that too." Julian glanced towards Sienna, who was surrounded by a group of children, her laughter carrying across the courtyard. "I hope so," he said quietly. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Sienna found Julian standing near the edge of the courtyard, looking out at the city lights. She approached quietly, the familiar warmth of her presence pulling him from his thoughts. "Long day," she said, leaning against the railing beside him. "A good one," Julian replied. But yeah, long. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Sienna spoke again. You know, when I first saw you outside the shelter, I didn't think you'd last a day. I thought you'd show up, make a few promises, and disappear like so many others. Julian turned to her, his expression earnest. I don't blame you for thinking that. But this place, it changed me. You changed me. Sienna looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You've proven a lot, Julian. Not just to me, but to everyone here. And I think you've proven something to yourself, too. He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. I have. For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. Sienna smiled, her expression softening. You are. As the evening stretched on, the shelter slowly quieted. The lights in the courtyard dimmed, and the last of the volunteers began packing up. Julian and Sienna lingered, the connection between them unspoken but undeniable. We've still got a long road ahead, Sienna said, her voice steady but hopeful. Julian smiled, his confidence restored. We'll face it together. For the first time in years, Julian felt at peace. He had found a purpose beyond profits and prestige, a place where he could truly make a difference. And in Sienna, he had rediscovered something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. As they walked back toward the shelter's entrance, side by side, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt full of possibility, built on a foundation of resilience, community, and the unshakable belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the right fight was always worth it.